Everyone, thank you so much for coming in this evening. An absolute pleasure to welcome back into the building and into this room Phyllis Lambert, who knows this room and the AA well and has been a great friend for many years, and who is here this evening to present a lecture titled Building Seagram, which coincides with the 2013 publication of what I think by far the most beautiful and important book in architecture, not just last year, but for many years. Something I can confirm because I've handed it out to many friends around town in recent months since it arrived here in our bookstore over the summer. A book that has, let's say, a certain similarity in being dark and bronze to a building that is both its subject and topic. It is a book that is both a personal account and an incredibly important scholarly historical document of the remarkable episode of the building of what's normally said in reverse, the Seagram building, which Phyllis plays a hugely important role in many, many different ways. As a 27-year-old, as she settles into New York in the 1950s and undertakes a project that really defines a century of modern architecture in remarkable ways. A building that changes architectural culture, not just in a provincial city like New York in the 1950s, but most certainly in North America and well beyond, and is the distillation of ideas that began many decades before by, amongst others, the author and architect of that building, Mies, an architect that Phyllis played an important role in bringing to that project and helped shape the project that resulted from it. Phyllis trained as an architect, studied at IIT. This is her first return visit to us, and I was remembering today, I think since about 2009, when Phyllis graciously came over and we offered a European venue for a beautiful film titled Citizen Lambert, which documented Phyllis's life in architecture, not just the remarkable projects that she's been a part of, not just in the founding of the CCA, her important role with Seagram, but also, and interestingly, as an activist who has worked throughout her career in every city that's been a part of her life to not just promote and shape architectural culture, but at times to even save it. From the flip side, you could say, of modern architecture's impulse, which is to constantly erase and start anew. And what she recognized early on, and I think in ways that very few people in modern architectural culture did at the time, is that modern architecture and its ideas would at some point come up against the fact that the world does need to remain as an architectural culture, and that culture in fact means that we save things at times and not only remove them to start anew. This is, you could say, the latest and certainly greatest installment of a series that I created a few years ago here called Modestly Great Clients in Architecture. I think the longer I'm around architecture and architects, the more I believe architects need to learn something about the forms of inspiration that sit outside of their own minds in studios and sit often in the imagination of the clients and the brilliant patrons that bring the various people together that make projects possible. More than anything, I think Phyllis is the absolute embodiment of that. It's an incredible pleasure, Phyllis, to invite you back. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Phyllis Lambert.
Do I just leave these at this level, or do I pull them down a bit? Can you hear me? Yep. Yeah. Brett, thank you for that very lovely intro. In the lecture I'm going to give today, I want you to think back to the 50s in New York City. Not what it is today. There's no such thing as a star architect. In fact, architecture didn't even exist, notwithstanding the Museum of Modern Art that had been there since the 30s. But it was an extraordinary time in the world. It was just after the war. There was a boundless conviction that we would make a great world, that would be one world, that there would be no more wars, that we could do anything we wanted, we could see the clouds, to make them rain we wanted to. We make Schlieren diagrams for making, analyzing acoustics. I mean, everything could be done. And so there was the optimism was enormous. The center of the art world turned to New York at that time, the New York School of Architecture. The whole changes of zoning in New York, I'll come to that. Changes, the development industry, the developers started to really become something. And by the 90s, they were called the aristocracy of New York. So it was a fast-changing world in many ways. And so this is just the image of the book. The client. Client is my father, and he was client de jour, and I was the client de facto. And here you see me with Mies on my right, and then Philip to the left, right of him, and a model of the Seagram building that photographs us in 1955. I worked in the architect's office, and I was the director of planning, which meant that I was the liaison between the architects, the company, the construction company, the rental companies, the engineers, everything. But I only had one idea, and that was to make sure that Mies built the building he wanted to build. That was, everything else was out of play. That was the only play I had. Well, oh yes, so the next thing I do want to say, I wasn't alone in this. The building committee of the building called in the summer of 1955. I was away for a month or so in Greece, and I was away for a month or so in Greece, and the head of the building committee, who was not very pleasant, decided with Eli J. Kahn, who was the architect who everybody said did the most competent buildings in New York. And then there was another man here who was the clerk of the works who connived with this one. They said, connived with all three. And they said, Mies's building of a T-shaped building was ridiculous. And that, so they changed it to it's a 3x5 bay building, okay, with a 1x3 bay at the back. And so they changed it to 4x5 bay. And I went down and I said, look, your job was to do the working drawings and you have nothing to do with design. And they said, we didn't change anything. So you can see that they really didn't understand very much. Anyway, they brought on the building, BMO, Building Monitoring Association, they still exist, to analyze buildings that were being built. I think it first started with the Chrysler building, because the top was so thin that you couldn't really make a proper floor there. They said, okay, we'll help. Anyway, this was this huge group of guys, and of course I was kind of nervous, and so was me, so was everybody. But they just said, this is the most beautiful building, everything works beautifully, and that was the end of that. But these were the kind of things if I hadn't been around, Mies might have just gone back before this had happened. Place. Well, this is what my father liked. And this is the building he built in 1927, and he liked it because he came to see the barons of whiskey in Scotland before setting up his company. And he admired them. It was a mutual admiration enormously. And so that was what represented whiskey making and all associated with it. And then in 1934, they went down to New York after the end of Prohibition and had offices in the Chrysler building. It was only 4 years old at that time, interestingly enough. And this is not very distinguished, but it is by a man by the name of, I always forget his name. Let me say, Morris Lapidus. Anybody know Morris Lapidus here? Yeah, he was considered the most vulgar architect that existed. He did the Fontainebleau in Miami. So I love to say that Lapidus is the successor to the Seagram, as Seagram's architect was Mies. I find that kind of funny. Anyway, Seagram they had expanded in that building quite a lot, and by 1952, 53, their offices were so extensive, and Seagram was sort of on the top of the world in that field, so that they needed more space, couldn't get more space, so they rented space in what was the new kind of building that was being done there. Now, I think my father had nothing to do with this. Certain executives went to see this, and this actually was the building they rented space in, but it wasn't built then. It was just another building like this. And so he went to see another building like this, and he looked around and he said, oh no, this is not possible. He'd been used to the wonderful lofty space of the Chrysler building when you got in. The quality of the building was marvelous. And this was a bit thin. And so they started looking for offices, for site. They decided to build. Well, it was a kind of off and on again. They never quite knew what they were doing. But anyway, they got advice from real estate companies. So this was Cushman and Wakefield, who turned out to be the company that did win the contract for renting the building and advice on the offices, of course. And they ran this. This is a prize, and you can see this was the quality of the buildings that existed then in New York. You know, this kind of thing, and the company like Emery Roth was an architect who was designing all of these by the yard. Park Avenue was part of an area that was very, very interesting then. This is Park Avenue in about 1920 something. And the park is really because there was a park in the middle of the street. And why it was there was because it covered the railroad cut that had been made for the New York railroad that came into Grand Central Station. So here you see it, with this kind of elegant thing. And all the buildings up from 50th Street to 90th Street, wherever, and on, were to be the same height. But by 1930, just before the crash, just at the time of the crash, the owners of most of the property down around Grand Central, the Golets and also the New York Central, decided that the area from 50th to 57th, Seagram is on 52nd and 53rd, the area between those two was going to be rezoned and no longer residential, but commercial. And nothing happened for quite some time because of the war, because of the financial crash, and then, of course, the war. So right after the war, this area was just ripe for development. And, I don't know why I have all that stuff there, but it's okay. Oh. Why do you think? Aha. Okay, thank you. I have to keep my fingers. Now, this is where Seagram's, the building that they bought to take down, and it was built in 1913, just after I guess the railroad was covered in the 70s and 80s. But there was that's when Grand Central, I think, was built. Anyway, 52nd Street is the lower street, 53rd is the top. And so they didn't consider that building. Well, I guess I'm not going to go to that. Okay. But so here is a map, a plan of George A. Fuller Company, who were the contractors of the building. There was the only a company who did all of these buildings from 1949 or 50 until 57, I think this was drawn. So you see the Seagram building, of course. Here is 52nd, 53rd, 52nd. And here's the Lever House Caddy Quarter. And then there was this wonderful building right across the street, the McKimmey and White building, Racket Tennis Club of 1926, 27, I think. And so, it was kind of a noble neighbor. And then in 1952, the Lever House was built. Well, something interesting about Lever House. The CEO who hired Gordon Bunshaft of SOM, Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, was a man by the name of Charles Luckman. And Charles Luckman's first calling in life was to be an architect. And the head salesman of Seagram knew this man, Charles Luckman, because he was a real salesman type. And so when there was a question of that, there was going to be a big event for Seagram's, the 75th event of the company's founding, and so distributors were to come from all over the world to come there and be told that if you really sell so many cases or whatever it is, you'll have a brick on the ground floor with your name on it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it was to be a kind of marketing tool to incite sales. And so he went, the chief salesman, who you'll see in a second, went to speak to Mr. Luckman, who had by then been let go from Lever House and had joined Pereira in Los Angeles. So this was the thing that they did. And I had been talking to my father. I had been going to the Institute of Advanced Studies, New York University. I'm not going to leave that on for long. It's too disgusting. And, well, I don't want to make you sick. And so anyway, I wrote a letter. This is page 1 of an 8-page letter to my father, and saying, no, 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 no. And I talked to him wrote about the macrocosm and the microcosm and the changes of ideas of the Renaissance, and how we were in a period where we had as great as architects that had lived since the Renaissance, and that I did a whole sort of, I didn't want to be stuffy or anything like that, so I did this marvelous play on two hillbillies in the street looking at that awful building you just saw and criticizing it. Anyway, the result was that my father said, come back and choose the marble. So I said, no, 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 nothing doing. And my mother then said, well, come back. Phyllis can do something. So I went to see, I spoke to, goodness, I can't think of his name, great critic in New York, his name I can't think of, and I spoke to Alfred Barr, who's a classmate of mine at Vassar College, was the assistant to him, and I met Philip, and I met all these people, and then my father said, well, you have to go and meet the head of the Fuller Company. I thought, oh my goodness, a man who is, a businessman, what am I going to say to them? Anyway, I knew so much, and I cared so much, and I was so fantastically unbudgeable that he said Phyllis ought to be the person to choose the architect. So I went on a trip for 6 weeks, visiting architects in their offices, obviously. You're not going to sort of, and you don't say to them, what would you do there? You say, who should do it? Who would make a major statement on in New York on Park Avenue, because that was the project. And so actually it was quite interesting. Very early on, I went, of course, at the Museum of Modern Art to speak to Phillip Johnson, who was just leaving then to set up his own office, and which Arthur told me about. And so very early on, one weekend, Eero Saarinen and his wife came to Philip's house, and so we had this wonderful discussion about how to go about who should be the architect. And Eero made this wonderful list of those who could and shouldn't, those who should and should and couldn't, and those who should and could. Well, should and couldn't would be Skidmore, Owings and Merrill themselves, because the Lever House was a nice building, but they didn't think that was too Bauhausian for them. And then there were the big firms, of course, and I'd gone to see some of those because Mr. Crandall had sent me, of the Fuller Company had sent me to see them. And the younger people were, Paul Rudolph, Lou Kahn, these were some of the people, and also Grapis. But Grapis was not on the first line at all. And then, who were the ones who could and should? There was Mies and Le Corbusier, really. And Frank Lloyd Wright, he was somehow at some point connected to my father's brother, my uncle, who knew, because I think his some relation worked for him. Anyway, Frank Lloyd Wright put in a big pitch for the building, and he said, I'll build you the tallest building, it'll be the greatest advertising in the world, 100 stories high. My father said, I don't want to meet my maker that soon. And of course, I didn't push that at all, because Frank Lloyd Wright was clearly an architect of the, when America was, manifest destiny. It was certainly not for the moment now. So, and at the very end, I went to see Mies, and Chicago, and I went to see. Then I had dinner at the Sarans with Philip. Philip came to meet me afterwards to go to look at the General Motors that Errol Saarinen had done. But when I went to see Mies, he was the most generous of all of them. Everybody else was talking in terms of the fact that they would do this or that different to Mies. And if you mentioned Le Corbusier's name, they said, oh, well, he doesn't know anything about building in America, or whatever it was. And so Mies said, of course, he could do it. He's a great architect. He's a great artist. And, there was a kind of sureness about the presence of that man. He had such an aura. And, of course, when I saw the buildings of 860 Lakeshore Drive, it just, physically, you were affected by this building. They were so beautiful. And so then we went to dinner. We went over to Michigan and had dinner with Errol Saarinen and his wife. And she was Eileen Nockham Saarinen. She was an art critic for the New York Times. And she had the mandate to do something on advanced architecture, contemporary architecture, and avant-garde. And so we had a very interesting discussion that if in 1920s you asked, should Mies van der Rohe, the student of Behrens, get the job, or Behrens, the answer would be clear. You would go for Mies. But in 1950, that wasn't so clear. That was not so eminently clear. And it was, because there were these younger people coming along, and but certainly Mies is, so I keep on moving things across. Can we just neutralize that piece, or I'll have to move or something? Thank you. Sorry about that. Oh, we got back to my letter? Okay. Ooh. Oh, yeah, so anyway, Mies. Mies, of course, was known for his 1921 skyscraper, which the Turm, the Friedrichstrasse building, which couldn't be built then. But, of course, he made history with this building and a couple of others. And then in 1950, he started building. He came to America in 1947 to be head of IIT School of Architecture and to build the campus. And there was this a developer in Chicago who was very smart, was a philosopher, understood, and Mies had done one of the buildings for him. But the chance to do a steel building came, and Mies was thrilled. So this is 860 Lakeshore Drive, and Mies had said, that when a building is construction, without, when you see the steel, it's overwhelming the quality of these structures. And this is interesting because when you remember the photograph of the Seagram that I showed first, on the cover of the book, that was done fast track. So while they were still building steel on the top, they were putting the glass in at the bottom, whereas here it was not. So you have this wonderful image of these two towers. And then Mies came to New York and was studying the site. He lived at a hotel just 4 blocks down on Park Avenue, and he walked around studying the site. And so here I just put what he came up with. This is the main tower floor. So this is the 3x5 bay with a 1x3 bay in the back. And the reason that happened was that Seagram's had only this part here, and there was not enough land to build 25% of the property in a sheer tower rising from the ground. Everybody else built these buildings, as I showed you, which went up 10 stories and stepped back, etc. So, and then the lower six floors, there was extra piece for the Seagram, sort of bustle, we called it. And here you see the plaza with the 90 feet back, and then the 3x5 main building, the elevator cores, the 1x3, and then this, where there had been these little buildings before, now we bought the property, and so Mies built a kind of a 3-story, 200-foot building horizontally. So these are very important elements, as I will explain in a minute. But this was in a magazine, so it's very nice to have everything at once. Here is the exterior corner. Of course, Mies in his corner is very Schinkelesque, of course. And then the re-entrant corner, where here there was a problem at the corner here, where this side, because this is covered with a green marble. And then here you see, it was the first building built floor to ceiling of glass, and here's the heating element, and this is all of the mechanical material that had to go on the floors. And here you see one bay of the mullions, and here you see the mullion itself with its connection to the glass, and then it became the place for the all partitions to go into, and that is really kind of the essence of the thing. But one thing I do want to show you before I move on is, you see there's an extra column in here, and right there. And Mies was accepted to do that. His engineer in Chicago, Mies felt that steel building ought to be able to move, but the engineers in New York said, no way, you can't do something like that because you can't have a crack in the ceiling for these high-paid executives. So here you can see that they put up this framing, steel truss, and then this was concrete up to the 17th floor, I think it was. And then you see the back piece here. But the reason I mention that is it's not that interesting necessarily, but Mies was so pragmatic, and he was a person who understood the issues, and he didn't like doing that because the clear structure was the most important for him. But if this was going to be less expensive, which it was, and the recommended by the people who were renting the space, he was going to do it, and that he was a very amazing person. Now here again is the idea of the building floor to ceiling. Seagram is on the left here. This is the lever house, so that this is a backing on both, masonry backing, and here is the UN building, sort of by Le Corbusier, but sort of not also. And here is a study of Mies's use of models. Here he, of course, earlier he had made a model of the site from 51st to 54th, and then back to Lexington and Park, to sort of see how to site the building. That was just he would look at it all day long. And then he made that little bronze model you saw in the photograph with Philip and myself. And here he made this full-size wood model. And one of the issues was the cost of doing this. Let's see now. Oh yeah, here we are. So that this is thicker here, because to make all bronze would make no sense. But you also don't want. You need a certain thickness, to make the thing look well. And of course, there are many differences between Philip and Mies as they went along. But Mies was the designer of the building. There's no question of that. And here again, you see the mullion. as it extruded. Mies happened to be working on, from 52 on, a aluminum building in Chicago in which they were using extrusions. And aluminum extrusions, the aluminum company wanted to have buildings built of their material, which was no longer used for war efforts. And so here you see the billet, you see it's sort of like squeezing the shape you get out of a pie, squeezer or decorator or something like that. And the windows were lifted individually from the outside. And here again, as I said, this is the building on the fast track, so you have, the glass going in on the bottom layers, the mullions being, attached on the next layers. Here the concrete is curing, here it's being poured, and here the steel is up to, I think, the 38th floor then, which is the top of the building. And then you see, of course, the Plaza and the sort of funny old buildings that were replaced. Mies was convinced that the buildings here would be, that replaced them would go to this height, sort of, and then step back and be a kind of a stronger poussoir to the building. But of course, once he did the building, New York City changed the zoning codes. And by 1961, the code was changed so that if you had 1 square foot of open plaza, as a developer, okay, developer, you could have 10 square feet of extra height in your building, and you'll see the result of that in a bit. Now, of course, this was topping out of the building, and this was actually at Seagram. Young guy over there, Tom, anyway, it's a good, nice American thing. It's a jolly image in the middle of the discussion. And here is interesting also because this was Philip's first go at the fountains. When Mies left from Chicago to New York to Chicago, because the AIA would not give him, some little person would not give him a license in New York because they didn't figure that his education was the standard of high school leaving, okay? So, and he was so insulted that he went back to Chicago. And so he said to Philip, well, why don't you work on the pools? Well, Philip did a project in which you had the whole building in water with only a path, in the center to get into it. And so he said, the building rises out of water, and Mies says that's exactly what it does not. So these were, and then Mies, of course, designed it, but Philip designed the pools, and at MIT was quite interesting. We all went up to study these things, and eventually you'll see the fountains are just in the front strongly, and none of this back there. Public space. Well, as I said, the people talked about the bronze, saying that was the great thing of this building. Well, he said, it would be as good as any other material. But the great thing is the plaza. That simply changed New York completely because this was so attractive. The change of zoning was so attractive to developers that just absolutely everybody did that in New York. So New York has a lot of little pocket parks now, and there's a long story about that, which I can't go into. Well, public space, when we were doing the Seagram building, I thought, well, this is sort of like, the plaza is sort of like a parvis in front of a cathedral. And obviously Mies did it so you could step back and look at the building, but he did it for a lot more reasons too. And it's his very first building when he was 21 years old, the Real House in New Babelsberg in Berlin. And so here you see, this is the house. You come in this gate over here. Let's see, where's the gate? There. You come in the gate. Oh yeah, sorry, over there. And over here. I'm sorry. Come in the gate over here. And then there's this amazing wall that you just sort of perceive, but there are these flower beds, and you go into the house, and it's just one step up from the house, and then you go in to the major room, you turn right, and you're at this porch here, and you're looking over this great garden down below. Well, there are a couple of things about that. I mean, this looks in many ways like the Seagram building. I mean, the sort of nobility, the strength of it, and of course it also looks like a temple with its high pediment. And then this wall has holes punched into it for functional reasons, and then there's the moving around. Well, Mies was very much influenced by Schinkel. He loved Schinkel. He said, Schinkel showed you everything you could do. If you, the noise, the museum, he said, he showed everything you could do. And so here he's at Charlottenburg in outside of Berlin, and that's the big Schloss over there. But this was a merchant's house, and it's a two-story house. You only see one story here, because Mies built up this terrace so that you just see one front in order to make a kind of neoclassical building. And then he has this great exedral bench that goes around here, and what do you call it, an arcade sort of thing down the side, and there's another word I can't think of, and a fountain here. So you have this, obviously to do this, you needed a very strong wall there, and so this is a kind of a way of having a public space that is created. Well, Mies does the same thing. He did the same thing, of course, in the competition he entered for the what is it, the great monument to what, Bismarck Monument. And he took it from Schinkel again. The country house is this great flat plain, and then fast down to the hill. And here in Barcelona, you come in, walk up the steps, you walk on this platform, and here you see it again, walking here. And this is the pool, bench, wall, and then one can wander in this way. There was the great sculpture here, and these were, of course, glasses of wall. And why Mies, of course, his discovery for himself was that you could separate the space-making elements from the structural elements. And, of course, these structural elements were also disappeared themselves in a way because they were made of chromed columns. Then, when he comes to the United States in 1947, he's commissioned to do the new campus for IIT. And this is a whole green plateau. But you can see, again, this is a kind of clearing in the forest of this building fabric of Chicago on the south side. And then at 860 Lakeshore Drive, there's not even any need for a plaza, except that he has two buildings and he connects. And you can see there was no problem of height. The travertine is at the same height as the grass. And so here at Seagram's, of course, this goes on, and Mies continues all of his buildings from there on, always have this kind of great, well, it's really a clearing in the forest. He said, you don't have, at 55 he said this, he said, you can't have cities anymore. They go on and on like a forest. And all you can do in this chaos is do the best you can. And so he made these wonderful places. And I'm going to now show you photographs by Richard Pear. All the photographs I've been showing you, and most of all of them are contemporary with the time the building was built, except for these that I asked Richard to do, because nobody's ever studied the Plaza, really. People just sort of say, oh yeah, Plaza, And so you have, these trees on the side, which create a kind of wonderful area. This extraordinary bench on both sides, more later on. The pools, which you saw image of. The steps, because there's a big change in slope here, and a much bigger one from here to there, must be 10 feet. And then you go from across the street, across a very wide, generous sidewalk, across the plaza. And this is the same material. This is granite too, It just isn't this drawing. I should change the drawing, but anyway. And then, so you can, usually in high-rise buildings, you go in elevators and bang, there's a wall here. You sort of get picked up and then you're at the top. But here, of course, you go right through. You could go down to 52nd Street or down to 53rd Street, or you could go into the Four Seasons restaurant, and here's where the great Picasso tapestry, hell no, it was for a hanging for a play. What do you call those things? So,
Tapestry.
pardon?
Tapestry.
No, it wasn't a tapestry. It was a.
Cloth.
Yeah, it was a. I don't know why the word isn't there, but anyway, there it hangs, and that's a big story afterwards. But let me just go through the photographs that Richard took. And here you see the ginkgo trees. Originally, they were another kind of tree that didn't, weeping beech, that didn't hold up very well in New York. You see the columns that sort of just show through and it's a bronze glass because the only glass at that time that was available was green, and so manufactured. And so this was made by Pott somewhere in an older technique. And, the green. Now you see the pools right up front. I mean, the fountains right up front. And these people sitting on the benches, sitting on the wall, sitting on the steps, sitting on the wall. And so it became a place where, without movable chairs or anything else, where people crowded in. And then, of course, you notice how the planting is handled. Not cut regular rectangles, but and just kind of a lovely reflection. And this was taken, Richard said, on the hottest day of the year. But I want you to notice the sort of great depth of this sidewalk. And this is where there's an expansion joint because of the railroad underneath. Here, it's there, and also this kind of marvelous elementarism, and this is again where Mies's, art, necessity creates art. This is an air intake for the air conditioning of the building, which is very sophisticated, and so you get this great sort of sense of it, of kind of a sculptural or elementarist kind of geometry. And here is this plaque represents the fact that the sidewalk, the building could have come to here, and it could have come to there. And you see the change of slope as you go down there, which is becomes quite radical. You see people, that's a 6-foot person, I guess, quite got underneath it, and of course the strength of those fountains. Now this wall at the edge of the Plaza, on both side streets. You had to have a barrier, of course, against falling off, and it had to be 3'6" high. So Mies said, why don't we make a bench that's 3'6" deep? And the city actually accepted this.
That's really quite amazing.
And then here's from the Plaza, looking into the Four Seasons restaurant that Philip did. And so this is from outside in, and you see the fountains reflected in the glass. And then you see from inside out. So this is the pool room on the other side, on the north side. And again, you're seeing in the fountains. And this is part of the trajectory which I love, where you're coming in from outside and going across Park Avenue, going across the sidewalk, the plaza, coming into the enclosure of the lobby, and going up to, going up to here, where you see a reflection of the McKim-Mead and Wright building, and then also the Picasso. And this is a reflection of course, McKim-Mead and Wright building. in the lobby wall. And here you see, looking from the lobby wall out to, this is photographed by, not by Richard, but by Ezra Stoller. And I love that photograph. It's, it's kind of the sense of the place. It's easy. It's you can, be under the trees and quietly reading. You can. A lot of people play pecking games there. It's just a kind of marvelous place. Well, now on to Philip, because I thought it was very important to give the background of both of why the Plaza and what did Philip contribute to this building. Well, Philip, as you see him here with his glass house, which he built before Mies's glass house, and there was all a certain amount of discomfort, let's just put it that way, about that. But anyway, Philip built a guest house in brick, because if you have a glass house here, you don't want to be looking another glass house to look at the other glass house. So, but Philip was perfectly understood that, first of all, the reason he was involved in the building was because Lou Crowdell of the Fuller Company said, Mies is, I think Mies was 72, not very old, is it? But anyway, he said, well, what happens if something happened to Mies? I didn't know. He said, what about Philip? I thought that was a great idea, because Philip was of New York, socially connected, artistically connected, and Mies and I were not. And Mies was, he didn't talk easily. And so that was a very good thing. And so when Mies said to him, Philip, how about Mies, Van der Rohe and Johnson? And Philip said, I had tears in my eyes. Nevertheless, he was breaking away from Mies at that point. But his idea, I'll get back to that in a second, but his idea was to do a Gesamtkunstwerk, that is, a building where everything was designed within the same idea. And so that the artwork, well, here, this is the only thing that isn't Gesamtkunstwerk. I mean, Philip is Mies's monuments, but here, Mies wanted the building, very carefully not to have the mess that you see mostly, where you see lights going all different ways. And so Philip made the Venetian blinds, so they were either up or down or in between. And then the luminous ceiling, which you see here in an executive bathroom, and the door-to-ceiling walls, doors, and etc. And this also included all the door handles, all the hardware in the bathrooms, even the toilets and or the fixtures. And then it was this idea of a tower of light. Mies wanted the building to be lit at night, and Philip worked with Richard Kelly and another manufacturer, a man who was this great lighting designer who had come from Yale, where he'd worked at the theater school. So the sense of drama was hugely there. And but at the same time, he was breaking away from me. So this is the interior of his brick house. Well, there are some round windows behind that wonderful material, except you don't see them, they're covered by panels. But what Philip wanted to do was to create this kind of closed environment. He took 2 rooms and modeled them 3 years after he'd built the house. So this is 53. And how do you get, you could go up so high, how do you light the walls? Well, you make a canopy so that you could get the lighting fixtures in at both ends. And it was absolutely magical to sleep there. There was a dimmer, and you turned that down, and the walls were, the material was kind of a pink Fortuny cloth. It was pink and gold and silver, the great Fortunys from Venice. And you turned the light down, it was like being in a desert. It was just incredibly wonderful. And then, of course, oh yes, I'm sorry, I want to say this. Well, actually, Philip later on, I'll say something about that, used, he was a postmodernist by then. He was using historical quotation. And this was Queen Louise's, Schinkel's Queen Louise bedroom in, oh goodness, where is that? But anyway, in 1930, this is photographs of 1930, because we know that, and Philip actually saw this room, so he's making that same idea. And but Barry Bergdahl sort of had a marvelous passage about how he described the pink and the rose and the closure of the room. And this is Philip's house, lit up, and so he called that his wallpaper. The landscape is changing wallpaper. The houses, and so in a glass house, what do you do for light? If you put a bulb in, you have 6 bulbs because you reflect it everywhere. So he worked with Richard Kelly, who had gone to Yale to study architecture and then gone into drama, only interested in lighting, and he, worked so that you would make a light around, and there was some way that reflected inside in the house. And the very first time he saw it, he said it looked like a hot dog stand. And then this is a photograph of it during the daytime, and this is a, see the wall, you see, of course, there's a big drop down there. You see the trees which Philip thinned out so that he could get as close as he could to this painting of The Death of Phocion by Poussin, of course. And this whole sense of landscape of Poussin and Schinkel were completely, Schinkel had the same sort of sense. And so here you see a Schinkel painting with, of course, the wall here and the landscape and the steep drop to the ground. And Philip published an interesting article in 1950 in a magazine, rare magazine called Flair, and showed this romantic lighting for a glass house. And so he's showing all of those points that I made about how it happened. But here you see, interestingly, this is with the trees lit from the outside, okay? And here you see it without any of that. So you see the fire in the fireplace here reflected back into the glass, etc. And this is his plan. But he talked about the importance of Schinkel for him, the importance of Mies for him. He talked about the Athens, going up the hill to Athens, and the trajectory going up, how things changed. He talked about Malevich and he was citing all these sources. That wasn't done then, and this was quite a very interesting thing. But the one thing he never talked about was Queen Louise's bedroom. But that's another thing. Nobody had ever worked on this thing of Philip's, and I did, because when I was, often went up to his house, and he was always going around saying, par 38, par 38. Par 38 is just a light that you can dim. And he was just absolutely entranced with it. Well, he worked on other projects, of course, from 1950s to when Seagram was built, and Mies asked him to design the Four Seasons restaurant. I'm just showing you a brief plan of it here. These rooms are 90 by 90, and the ceiling is about 20 feet high. So Mies took, because there was only 3 floors above here, Mies could take out a column here. So he removed this column, and he also removed the column there. And there's a mezzanine here. This is the mezzanine where they were supposed to have the sometimes I get a hole in my brain. The Rothko paintings, So just so you see where that, you see there's opening and a screen can pull across. There's a pool here. And this is where the Picasso is. And then this is a wall here. And then this is the bar and grill room. And here is a extraordinary sculpture by Richard Lippold that was made because, well, I'll show you why it was made. And then, of course, the staircase to come up from below 52nd Street, which is the major entrance to the restaurant. So here you see the entrance from the down here, so Miro Tapestry was there at the point, and you came up the stairs, and this was in order to make greater intimacy over the bar. Richard Lippold was commissioned by Philip and myself to actually do a sculpture that would bring the ceiling down, a very ingenious idea. And then you see the curtains. Well, Philip went to, I can't remember her name, Mary somebody, and said, we need some curtains there. And so they're made of aluminum chain, and the chains are either gold or reddish gold or silver. And so very much, of course, like the colors in in his house, the walls on his house. And what happened is that they move because the convectors are underneath them, so they flutter like this. And Philip thought, oh my God, this is awful, they're going to get rid of me forever. But of course, everybody was very excited about it. It's like watching a fire. You know, you're fascinated by seeing these curtains move all the time. And then here you just see another view of it where you start to see through the curtains. You see the way, depending on how the light is, you either see fairly much or not too much. And of course you see, again, that. And this gives a kind of sense of what it's like to be there. And this is an image looking up at these rods, these brass rods, which are of different height, and they're hung by two wires. And this is a pattern of them. The person who made this drawing for me and a couple of other ones is in this room tonight, so I'm pleased to see her here. And then this is the wall to where the Rothko room was to be. So this is the pool here, and remember I showed you this wall, and this can pull back from here and be completely open if it's just the stacked doors. And Rothko, well, I'll leave that for a moment. Rothko was commissioned. He came to see, we were standing in the door just to the right, and there was just concrete on the floor, and there were just these wonderful walls of glass. He was never very clear about his own credentials as an artist, and he was nervous. And this was a fantastic commission for him, because it was to be able to do a whole suite of images together as playing off of each other, like in a gallery. And so he worked on it, and he got disgusted, and he was disgusted with himself. He actually, what is interesting is he turned his horizontals vertical in the second group of paintings, and he said, then he talked to, he took a boat and he talked to the editor of a journal in New York, and he said, you know, those bastards, I'm going to get them, I'll make this, you know, he was against rich people, and so he was very vituperative and angry. But he loved the sense of this room, very much like some of the Schinkel stuff, actually, that you were enclosed. He said bricks, but of course not bricks, it was stone, that you felt that you were enclosed, you were bending your head up against a closed wall, you were in a tomb, as it were. But this has very much a sense of Rothko's paintings. And so here I show, he gave them finally to the last group, to the Tate here, that's why I'm making some bit of fuss. I'm not sure that, I don't see how it could have been hung any differently, okay? I looked at the sizes and things like that. And so Catherine Bella also did this perspective for me, and we put the things up. So, okay, the Picasso. The Picasso is on the wall between the two restaurants I showed you, the place of it. And there's a big deal now. I'll talk about it later if somebody wants to question me about it. The man who owns the Seagram building now is a man who thinks he's a gift, God's gift to collecting art. Also, and he uses his own buildings to be able to put his own collections up. And he wants to take this down, which he calls a rag. And he says there's a problem with the wall. I just spoke a few minutes ago to the people from the Conservancy in New York. Oh, it's just incredible. Anyway, this is a wonderful the three-corner hat made by Picasso in 1919 that Diaghilev had commissioned De Falla to do the opera and then Picasso to do this. This is the curtain. It has nothing to do with the opera at all, but it gives a Spanish kind of sense. And there's a woman here in London, a film critic, who sort of said that this was Picasso, this is his wife, Olga at the time. This was a little funny young man who was rather difficult that came with them, and that this was Diaghilev in drag, which I love. Richardson said that's not so, but I'm not sure that isn't so. And of course, this was the whole idea of the curtain, because 20 by 20, which was this part here, would not make a stage curtain, so it had all these elements around it. Apparently, some people said it was just grey. I don't know, but anyway, Diaghilev cut this down in order to sell it, because he was always in need of money. And so it went around. It was sold to a man in Switzerland, and then it was sold again to a person who happened to be a woman. We haven't ever found out who she is. And it was up for sale in New York in '57 when there were quite a number of other stage curtains, that's the word I want, stage curtains that were for sale. Anyway, this was absolutely extraordinary in terms of its color, the artist, the scale of it, just an amazing thing. Okay, well, that's part of public art, actually. And here I wanted Picasso to make sculptures for the Four Seasons restaurant on the corners. So here he is. I'm showing him some material from you can actually see it from the Seagram building. And that's Marie Coutelier, who was a great, she made these great tapestries with new materials. And he at that time wanted me to have these sculptures on the Plaza. And I wasn't really very intrigued by that. I thought that they were, I don't know, I wasn't. And so, and actually, I sent him, apparently I was going to send him examples of the bronze drawings and things like that. But somehow, Jacqueline did not want me to come back. So I think there was some jealousy there, so whatever, nonsense. So I never went back, and that was that. But the idea of sculpture on the Plaza, which was a much better idea, was to have works of sculpture from time to time that were being a sculptor whose work is being exhibited one of the museums or one of the good galleries. And so this was the first piece that was put in 1965. I had nothing, 1965, I had nothing to do with it. And this was a Olmec head that had come up from Mexico, and it couldn't fit anywhere else except on the Seagram Plaza. So there it was. And then it became a great place for the display of art. I guess maybe that's where the man who owns the Seagram building now thinks he can put his own things there. This is, of course, a broken obelisk by Barnett Newman, and I think it's a wonderful photograph. It's something, you see, the building that would be here is not here yet. It was in construction, just in foundations. So you see that wonderful church just up the street in that image. And at one point, later on, the CEO of Seagram asked to have sculptures in the pools. And so the question was, we asked Moore to do, and he came over. And unfortunately, I don't have any photographs, so I never took any. But he didn't want to do it. He said, because you're always looking at the buildings on the side, you're never really looking at the sculpture of Seagram. So as I go through these images, you'll see that. And you know, we're looking at the, of course, McKinney and White building, which is wonderful. This is light up by Tony Smith. And what's sort of super about it is that, you know, it became an event. You can see people watching when these works were put on the plaza. And they always had to be very carefully engineered so that, you know, it didn't crash through. But you see those ghastly buildings on the side. Not when you're there, somehow it doesn't affect you. And then this is Richard Long, who in 2000 did something called brownstone. Brownstone is a material used for a lot of row housing in New York. And so this was actually the day that he was installing it, and it's called the Brownstone Circle. And Joel Shapiro, which is a beautiful photograph. I love the scale of it, and the fact that you only see the Seagram building and the work, and that was on the Plaza in the fall of 1986. We had a continual program for this, and there was an exhibition of, because we bought lots of work of art for the Seagram offices, and they also were displayed on the fourth floor gallery. And then here's another photograph by Richard Pear of Milord La Chambre by Jean de Buffet, which was there just after it was completed in 74. And then there was a woman who did these marvelous performances in New York, in dance in relationship to the fabric of the city. And so I asked her to do a project at the Seagram building, and she did. And the flautists stood in the two pools on both sides. There was a red felt roll, a light felt roll that came all the way down, and dancers stood in the windows. And then they came down through the revolving doors out of the plaza, and everybody joined them on the plaza. That was kind of a great, we only did one of those. Well, I'm coming to the end of my talk. There are lots of things I'm missing, but anyway. Sustaining architectural culture. There were two real huge problems. One was the zoning, which, as I have mentioned, changed New York, and so that was, that affected a lot, and there's a lot of more detail about that and how it was not very good at the beginning, and Holly White really did a study to show that most of the plazas that were done, they'd sort of say, well, we like the sculpture, they put it there. There were no amenities. It was a real problem, but that's been changed. And then there was but also you get these very tall buildings because of that. And so I'll show you that in a minute. But one of the things that really worried me enormously was Seagram only used half the zoning area that it could. It could have used, another 500,000 square feet. The building itself is now 500,000 square feet. So you were allowed, in the days when Seagram was being built, this was not a question, but it became a question as kind of the bottom line became a strong question in terms of financing buildings. And so the problem was to try and get rid of that. Well, I made studies in my own office to see, I became an architect afterwards, but and these were in the studies in the 80s, I believe. And so the question was to take, you see, this is the Seagram building in both cases, and if we could own the land cooperatively with, actually, in this case, the City Corp, and then take the zoning extra area, and put it into this building, which otherwise would be at the height of the others, or if we put it behind the Seagram building, which is in a lot behind there, which is not so great. And then what finally happened was the building was bought by a German developer this is the man who wants to know, who thinks that the Picasso is a rag. And he bought the Seagram building and bought the land behind it, so on 52nd Street and Lexington. And so with Norman Foster, he planned this very, very tall tower. And of course, all of these things, there were lots of discussion about them. But money is money in New York. And hard to avoid. And what's happened in New York is you're getting now, even more so, these very thin pencil buildings. This is on 90 feet by 90 feet. This very tall building. I forget how many feet over, how many stories above Seagram, but you can see it's very big. Not this one, I mean this one, the one I showed before. Yeah, this one. This, of course, is the City Corp, which is an interesting building. That 45-degree was meant to do something about angle of the sun, and never happened. But there's also a chapel built into the bottom of the building, which is quite interesting. But now what is happening is that you get the major businesses in the United States building in this area, because you remember I told you about the zoning change, and this area is now an area that became a kind of a place that you could even build. The only prestigious buildings built in New York outside of Chase Manhattan down in Wall Street were actually the buildings around Seagram. On Madison Avenue, I mean, really lousy addresses, okay? I mean, not narrow streets. But so this is IBM, and it was done by Barnes, and it 10 years after it was built, it was sold. It's now called 598 Madison. And it's just, there was some sort of an opening at the bottom which allowed them to make the building taller. And this is Phillips AT&T, again, a major capitalist organization that because of the economics, it was sold by them. And it's now Sony, and Philip had a whole area underneath that was open, and that's all filled in with Sony shop windows. And of course, there's no penalty for doing this. This is just the way it goes. And then just across the street from the Seagram building, luckily behind the McKim, and White building, SOM built this tower, which is a kind of a hotel, I think, or something like that. And you can see the Seagram building here on the McKim, and White tennis here. Well, these are the problems that one faces in the city, and the only way you can really protect your own property is with a whole kind of maintenance program. And when Seagram's was sold in 79, it was not old enough to be landmarked, and so we put in. I said to Seagram, "You have to protect the building," and so working with the lawyer, I hired architects to work with the lawyers, and we put a series of documents which really give the conditions of the building and the specifications and everything else, and said they had to comply. And if they don't comply, then the sort of carrot and stick. And the stick was that Seagram would not pay its rent, and it has 1/3 of the building, so that could be kind of a problem. And it worked very well for many years until the building got sold again. And anyway, these are extremely important issues, but the tradition of the quality of the building was such, and the maintenance of it was very important. This is hugely important for all architects everywhere. This must be done, and for owners. Well, I'm just about at the end of my talk. This was Seagram building in 1958, and you can see the area all around it. There was this building, remember I said that was in construction, and so you could see the church, and this was replaced too by Pretty Creek. All of this is now high-rise buildings. But I actually had a photograph taken from the same angle, not today, and all you see a whole lot of tall buildings and Seagram sort of down in there. So that didn't do anything for anyone. So I'm using this photograph by Ezra Stoller. It was made in 1991, and you can see all of those new buildings, of course. That one to the right, this one to the left, the one behind, that's the City Corp building, and there's probably something here now. And but still, when you walk up Park Avenue, down Park Avenue Drive, whatever, it's just amazing the kind of presence that this building has, its proportions, setback, the life of the Plaza. And one wonders why people can't do such simple things. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Phyllis. Thanks for a fantastic talk. To open up the questions, what was the reaction like with New Yorkers? If you say something, I mean, you touched on the point of the, in this room, we would all know well how the building resonates, you could say, within architectural culture. You touched on the developers and how quickly different models of development kicked in related to this. Amongst New Yorkers, how did the New York Times treat it? How did it
New York,
live?
it was just from the very beginning a wonder. Everybody adored it. However, about the Plaza, this was very interesting because at some point or other, the 1961, Seagrams realized it was being charged much more for its property than any of the other new buildings around. And so they took this to court and finally lost. And it was discussed because Seagram did not use all of its, it was throwing away half of what it could have, half of the amount of building it could have been used, and this empty plaza. And there were people who actually said, this is disgusting to throw away this property. But actually, I mean, I think it's interesting. And there was a big court case, was really very, very interesting. All of that's in the book. But, and there's also a big court case about landmarking the building in 1989, when it was landmarked. But 79, 89, 89, I think. Anyway, from the very beginning, the Seagram building was hailed as a great building, and it's been loved ever since. So there's just, there's a marvelous reception.
In the city, maybe one other component from the city side, the city government. I can remember, I'm thinking it was Ada Louise Huxtable that might have written a piece once on some sort of a court case around possibly taxing the building separately because it was publicity and promotion.
Well, that's it. That's the thing I was saying. That's the thing I was saying, that the Seagrams realized they were being taxed more, and they took that case to the various courts in New York and lost. And so I was sort of compressing all that together, but what the argument of the courts were, they didn't know. It's a complicated thing. It was something new, although, of course, there had been other examples. The Rockefeller Center, but some of the first court said, the lowest court said, this was conspicuous consumption. A little bit, the judge wasn't quite right up on his literature. And they did say that. They said that it was, there were two sides of it. One was you're throwing away things, and what was the thing you said?
About using the building for promotion or publicity.
Yeah. And so they said that.
It was an anniversary.
But the final court, the highest court in New York, did not do that. The solution they made was that for all the space that Seagram used, they taxed that because that was corporate in their own name. But to tax, were they going to tax the Lever House because its name was Lever, and it gave this was slightly specious, I think.
You didn't touch on it at the end, but what did Mies say afterwards? The experience of working in New York, the time period. It's obviously a hugely important project to his career. We translated last year. We found the conversation recorded that he held here at the AA in spring of 1959. So within a year of the building finishing, what I found interesting was that he says nothing about Seagram in that particular interview. And it was, in fact, he spends an hour or two with AA members talking about Germany, how he ends up arriving in the States. But what did he say about the experience of working and wrestling with everything involved with New York?
Well, he did have that crazy thing where he had to go back to Chicago. This was the end of 55, I guess. Well, he didn't have to go back to Chicago, but he was so insulted and so hurt that he did do that. And then, of course, the thing was changed, and he got his license, and you had to, we had to push politically to do that. The AIA said, New York branch said, why doesn't he take a high school leaving exam? Would you like to do one right now? Yeah, completely nutty. But so that was kind of a bitter experience, but he always had bitter experiences somewhere along the line. In Germany, when he was doing the National Gallery, and they were raising the roof, and it was dramatically raised, and the governing body of the city was there, and it went up very, very, very quietly. And then these men stood underneath it, and they said, the acoustics aren't very good. And Mies said, yeah, but that's what they have philharmonicas for. There was always something that wasn't quite right.
Fantastic. Questions?
Thanks. When you look back at Lever Brothers commissioning Gordon Bunshaft and you and your family commissioning your building, and you compare today with examples such as Apple.
With what?
Apple commissioning Norman Foster
Yeah.
today on the West Coast, and Facebook commissioning Frank Gehry. How do you see, are there any differences between the corporate patrons of your generation versus what is going on today on the West Coast?
Well, it's not only just the West Coast, it's a little bit of New York also. But, the whole phenomenon of the star architecture, star architect came in. As I said, in New York, when we started working on the Seagram building, architecture was simply not a subject. And it wasn't until the fight for the fight about the taxation, which hit all the papers, and everybody said this is how to ruin architecture for the future, to put taxation on good buildings. And at the same time, the Pennsylvania station had come down. So there was great protestation to that. And of course, it was just a terrible thing that was put up in the space. So that is the point that people started to become aware of architecture in New York. And then, of course, New York has really not built very well and very much. There have been a couple of, Gary did a sort of building. It's not a great building downtown. And of recent things, I can't think of much. Zaha's building a building there now, and I haven't seen it. And there are a couple of, around the High Line. And, these are the great things that happen in New York, the High Line and the Lincoln Center. That whole changing of a place, a street, like 65th Street, which was just awful. There were trucks that went in there, streets, cars that went up and down, very high travertine walls. And they made that, and the Plaza also, they made that, Durham Scafidio made that into a wonderful place. But it's more what's happening. There's these small interventions, which became very big in these cases in New York. And the building developers have such high control there, and the bottom line is the most important thing for them. The cost of architects are such a small part of the overall. They spend more on advertising, but somehow all these developers want to control their architects, and that's unfortunate.
I'm very interested by what you said about the Plaza and the details of it, which I've been to it many times and still found new things from your talk in it. But I'm just wondering how Mies took that on, if he did, or if he was able to do, in his other big commissions in Montreal and Chicago, like the Dominion Center, because this question of what is on the ground level around tall buildings is enormously important.
Is that a remark or a question?
Well, I'm just asking, was it your impression that this particular plaza was important to Mies in his other big projects?
I think I've tried to show it was kind of evolutive. He starts off with that porch, which is on the same plane as almost the garden and the house in 1910 in the real house, and he's looking over the thing. So he's already knitting together. Maybe I didn't make this very clear, I should have. He was knitting together landscape and building. And so it's landscape and building, then it's building and plaza, building and city, okay? So he's making these kind of oases, or one could call them clearing in the forests, in the city. And he did that always afterwards. So, you know, then he, you know, I showed how he was so interested always in that kind of plane that the building sat on with a huge drop that happened. He creates that at the real house. And then he, which is interesting, fascinating, for a young 21-year-old, my goodness, what an idea. And then he, you know, when he comes to do the first high-rise, really, of any consequence he did a concrete one, but was 860. And there again, you have that sense of the plaza, sense of isolating the building to a certain extent from the area. And then in Toronto, it's because I've also, in Mies in America, I discussed the importance of movement for Mies. That as you walk through across the building, you know, the building is open and closed. Sometimes it has a solid wall, sometimes it has a much greater opening, like some of your work. And so that's, that was extremely important for him. And his drawings for the IIT campus, he made a whole lot of sketches of what you would see from here, what you would see from there, as you walked through the campus. So he was very, very interested in that. So the Toronto Dominion Centre really allowed that more than anything else, but also in Chicago at the Federal Center, and the Montreal, the Westmount Square.
But Liz, thank you. Fantastic lecture. But did you witness Mies at work as a designer? I imagine you saw him.
Yeah, I had my office.
Yeah, could you describe that? That would be very interesting.
Well, he would make, I guess he made, a Seagram building, I'll describe that, okay?
Yeah.
He made, he studied, first of all, okay, for me, facts. What are the facts? The facts are elevators, the facts are zoning, and the facts are the size of the office. What is a minimum size of office, okay? And so he gets the information of that from the real estate people. The elevators, he asked Philip to work on to find that out, and Philip said, oh, disaster, we can't, it's all elevators. And then when he was working on this, the tower, and didn't have enough land, you know, then he quickly made this wonderful solution to how you could do it. He said, you know, if first of all, we could have had those buildings and put you know, use them as part of the Seagram building. Didn't make any sense at all. So he made this wonderful thing. Again, I didn't say this, I don't know what my problem is, but anyway, the great thing about the Plaza and the Seagram building is you have life on the ground floor. And this is in all of Mies's other buildings, the bank building in Toronto, the post office in Chicago. And so you're always, you see people there, you see life in there. And that is, you know, that's very significant, I think.
But I wondered if you'd seen his proportioning and sense of composition in that facade is so great. You know, there's the balance between horizontal and vertical.
Well, he had a kind of, the golden mean was to him a kind of, some of his people who in his office described as taking a 30-60 triangle and, you know, just sort of, that gives you the golden mean more or less in proportioning the windows and things like that. But he paid attention to that up to a point. But for example, at Crown Hall, where he took 2 feet off the height of the Crown Hall, the building, the architectural school in Chicago, because that would save money. And he said it was not quite as good, but it really wouldn't be noticed.
Oh, really?
But then there were other things for example, just a really funny little detail on the Seagram, the Seagram sidewalk was not granite originally. Just the curb was granite. And normally in New York, how they do the curb is they take a piece of steel, and they take the concrete and throw it up to the edge of the steel. So you have this miserable piece of steel at the edge of the curb, and that's it. And so Mies made a granite curb, about that deep, I guess. And so somebody in the building committee sort of, always saving every penny they could, say, well, what is the point of that? Nobody will notice it. And Mies said, yes, that's just the point. Is that, I could go on and on. But I just think it's that fantastic idea of, making that. I mean, you just have these intuitions of making the bench, 3'6" deep instead of 3 feet.
Quick decision, or did he spend time looking?
I don't know. Sometimes he made quick decisions. Sometimes it took a long time.
Did he work with models in the facade?
To do that, he worked with models. Yes, he worked with model to do certain things. I showed some of them. And he actually, when he was working on, I was in the office then because I went to IIT school afterwards, and I had a desk in the office, which I used to love. I see everything that was going on. And on the Berlin, that great hangover, it's not a hangover, what is it called? Yeah, anyway, he studied that so very carefully. He had a 1/3 model or something like that on the wall. He studied things with great care.
And how did he present to the building committee? I'm fascinated to know.
To the building?
When he was presenting to the clients, how did he...
Oh my goodness. Well, on the Seagram building, we had this little tiny bronze model, and I have a brother who said, I said, you have to think you're this small. He said, if I thought I was that small, I wouldn't be a good businessman. And so people treat models as toys anyway. And I think the renderings helped more, but he never did renderings. He'd make photographs of the models. And so anyway, my father and Lou Crandall of the Fuller Company came, and maybe the head of renting. And, here Philip and I and Mies were all very excited and thought, he's going to say this is the best thing he'd ever seen in his life and how marvelous it was. And he looked and he said nothing. So Mies was going to go back to Chicago, and I was going to go back to France, and Philip was going to go off somewhere, I don't know what. But, then he got all the information, and, asked all the people the cost and all that sort of stuff. Then it went ahead.
There was a question here, Christina.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, because I was quite fascinated about...
Could you hold that closer to your mouth, because I can't hear you very well?
Yes.
That's great.
I was interested in one of the photos you show where you were sitting on your own in the middle of a room with another 20 men sitting around you. And I was thinking, how was it working as a woman in New York in that time? And because at the same time you were acting, I guess, as a client, and you were also part of the design architectural team. It was a lot to take. I mean, you seem a smart and determined woman, but still, it was the 50s in New York, and it's a very kind of male-dominated industry. So can you explain a bit how was that for you?
Could you help me with that? I'm sorry, I could hear everybody else, but I...
The incredible photograph you showed early on
with all the men.
Of all the men in the room, and you're holding your own in the middle of that crowd. The question is, how did you do that? What was that culture like then, and what did it take for you to stand up?
Well, I'll tell you two things. First of all, my father never gave me the job. Lou Crandall gave me the job of going to look for the architects. And then I decided I had to stay and be on the building committee. And how did I convince my father about Mies in the first place? Well, in that long letter, I told him that when a business is going to build, they have a responsibility not only to their own company, but to the city they're in and to the world. And, that's absolutely true. Why build? Just go and rent somewhere otherwise. And I guess that I was so deeply convinced that I was quite unshakable. and other people backed me up. But the other side of it is that, you know, the corporation was a big corporation, and so was the Fuller Company, a big corporation. And if I goofed or went off the line somewhere, did something that was going to cost them some money or whatever, more money than they thought, you know, something wrong, that you could always recoup that very quickly. So there wasn't, you know, there wasn't too much worry about it. But also the other thing is that since I happened to be the daughter of the president of the company, I couldn't say anything that was wrong. If I said that this room is purple, they'd say, yes, Mrs. Lambert, you know?
I think we'll stop there. Phyllis, thank you so much for this
You're
evening.
very
Good
welcome.
to have you back. Thank
Yes,
you.
Laura?
Phyllis, I don't even know the answer to this. I wanted to mediate this question in a slightly different way, which is to say, were you always the only woman in the room? In other words,
No, there was her
ever-
secretary taking the notes.
Right, right. Were there ever any women besides you and the secretary? Did you ever, in this process, encounter other women with
Not until
responsibility and authority?
not until I became an architect myself.
Yeah.
And then when I was with Gene Summers, and we had a architectural firm and development company, I'd go with him. People would think I was either the secretary or maybe I did interiors. And, you know, I mean, but you know, I none of those things bothered me. I had something I wanted to do and had to do, so you just push those things out of the way. You know, I mean, you could get yourself all upset, but what is the point? It wasn't even what was the point. You had something you really wanted to do.